This morning, we're going to talk about choices. The kind of choices that can change your life forever. There are a lot of choices that make big differences in our lives. Do we get married? Who do we get married to? Will we have kids? What job do we take? Where do we live? And these are all big decisions, life-changing decisions. But today, we're going to specifically look at those kinds of decisions that once you have made them, there's no going back. The decisions in our lives of which the consequences, good or bad, follow us all the rest of our lifetime. Today we're going to read about such a decision that was made by King Saul. Before we get into our passages in 1 Samuel, let's back up and set the stage. Saul had been anointed king over Israel. Most of the people had accepted him. And then sometime during that first year of his reign, the Ammonites invaded and attacked a town. And Saul, it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he called out Israel, and over 330,000 men responded, and Israel went forth and won a great victory. After that, everybody accepted Saul as king. And then we saw last week, Samuel has his little retirement speech where he reminds everybody this was not a good thing when you asked for a king. And then Saul dismisses all the people, but he keeps 3,000 men to be his army. Never before this time has Israel had a standing army. As you recall, always before God would raise up a leader in time of need, that leader would call the people out and they would gather. And then God would give victory. But now Israel has an army. But what kind of army does Saul have? It says there were some mighty men among them, these great warriors. But honestly, most of his army would have been made up of farmers, maybe some caravan guards. And regardless of whether we had a few mighty men and a whole bunch of farmers, we do know one very interesting fact about this whole army. We find it in chapter 13, starting in verse 19. No blacksmiths could be found in Israel, because the Philistines had said they couldn't have any. Otherwise, Israel, the Hebrews, will make swords and spears. So up till this time, Israel, anybody who needed to have their equipment for farming sharpened, their mattocks, their hoes, their plows, they had to go to the Philistines to get the stuff sharpened. So basically we learn Israel had no weapons of warfare. So how did they beat the Ammonites? Again, they didn't have swords and spears. They had hoes and sticks and clubs. Now against the Ammonites, that was okay because Israel and the Ammonites were kind of in the same boat. They were on the same level. But the Philistines, who were really the big dogs militarily in the area, had said, none of you can have weapons. No swords. No spears. And we'll do this by making sure you're not allowed to have any blacksmiths. Now you recall that the Philistines had left Israel alone while Samuel was in command, if you will, as he led Israel. The reason for that was very simple. Even without swords, anytime the Philistines came against Israel under Samuel, they lost. Why? Because God was leading them. God directed them in those times. And so, under Samuel there was peace. But apparently one of the provisions for this peace, the Philistines said, y'all cannot have blacksmiths. Now, this might seem kind of difficult to do, but you have to remember this is kind of the middle of the Iron Age. And blacksmithing was a very skilled profession. They weren't just anywhere and everywhere. I mean, nowadays, if something breaks on the farm, you fix it, don't you, Daryl? I mean, you know how to weld, you know how to beat things into submission. You can fix a lot of things. Back then, they still could fix things by getting a new stick. But they couldn't sharpen. They couldn't make their iron equipment because the Philistines had a stranglehold on all the blacksmiths. So Saul is keeping these 3,000 men, these 3,000 poorly armed men, to be his standing army. What good is an army, though, if you don't ever use it? So Saul keeps 2,000 men, and he keeps them over at Bethel. That's kind of the capital of the kingdom of Israel. And he sends 1,000 men with his son to the town of Gibeah, which is to the south and very close to the Philistines' territory. And then sometime in the second year of his reign, it starts, and we read about it in chapter 13, verse 3, something very interesting happens. Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah. Now some commentators would like to talk about, Jonathan kind of doing this on his own, and then later Saul takes credit. I really disagree with that. I mean, we're going to read it, see what you think. It's verses 3 through 4 here. Then, after Jonathan had fallen on this garrison, Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all of Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines. I don't think Saul is taking credit for something that Jonathan did. I don't think he's trying to defend his son. I think in this we see that Saul is making an affirmation of the fact that he commanded Jonathan to go forth. What did I just say a second ago about armies? If you have one, what good is it if you never use it? I think, if you think about it, Saul was jealous. All the days of Samuel, the Philistines were beaten. Samuel was able to defeat this much more powerful and well-trained enemy. And there was peace because of it. I think Saul felt the need to show that he was just as powerful as Samuel was. So he goes out and starts a war. You ever been in that situation? You ever felt like you had to somehow match up to your predecessor in your job? You had to do as well as your parents in something by chance? Not just as well, in fact, really, let's be honest, we've got to do better than that, don't we? So Saul started a war. And then he calls Israel to battle. Well, in the meantime, the Philistines muster for war too. And in verse 5 it says they brought up 30,000 chariots, 6,000 cavalry. That's just the elite part of their standing army. And that's more than 10 times more than what Saul has. On top of that, they would have had foot soldiers that were also trained. And then, of course, they call up everybody. And so the Philistines gathered. It says their foot soldiers were like the sand of the seashore. And the Philistines came up and they camped at Michmash. Now, Michmash was an Israelite town, so they came in and they captured this town. Now, I'm going to kind of illustrate for you, if you will, the map, as you can imagine. You've got this long, narrow strip that's the Israelite territory. The coast is over here, and you've got the coast is controlled by other nations. Up here, the Phoenicians. You've got what's left of the Canaanites over here. And down to the south, you have the Philistines. Running down the narrow valley around the Jordan River, that's what Israel controls. Very rich, very fertile, down the strip down the middle. Down south, you've got Judah and the little tribe of Benjamin. Up north, you have the 10 tribes. Right between the two, though, the Philistines have this finger of territory that reaches in, almost cuts Israel in half. You've got the southern 2, and you've got the northern 10. Well, Jonathan was sent right here. What was the name of that town? Gibeah. Okay? Saul sent Jonathan to a town right about here, just north of this finger that the Philistines controlled. Bethel is up here to the northeast. That's kind of the capital of Israel at the time. And then you've got that city we're going to hear about in a minute, we've heard about before. I just lost track of it. Gilgal. That's it, Gilgal. These are the 3 important places. Jonathan attacks into the Philistines' territory. And then Saul, over here in Bethel, calls all of Israel to gather at Gilgal. So Jonathan takes his 1,000 over here to Gilgal. Saul moves with his 2,000 over here to Gilgal. And then the Philistines move into this town called Michmash. It's right in the center. They ignore Gibeah, and they move their hundreds of thousands of troops right into the center between Gilgal, where all of the Israelite army is, such as it is, and Bethel, which is the capital, if you will, of Israel. Saul's got a problem. Saul has a very big problem. He has put himself and his army on one side, his capital on the other. And the army of the Philistines is camped right between. And it says, when they moved up, that the people were afraid. And so Saul's left with 2 main cities to protect, and he can't reach the capital. His enemy is between him. And so the Philistines, rather than attacking a fortified city or attacking Bethel over here where the ark is, they've taken the center ground and they're forcing Saul to come to him. That's why it says in verses 6 and 7, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, where the people were hard pressed, you think, then the people hid themselves in caves and thickets, in cliffs and cellars and in pits. And also some of the Hebrews even crossed over into Jordan and the land of Gad and Gilead. But as for Saul, he was still over here in Gilgal. And all the people who were with him were afraid. Saul's in trouble. Saul's wanting to show that he's just as great as Samuel. But the Philistines put their army in the field first. And it's larger even than the 330,000 that Saul was able to gather the first time he had a fight. And the Philistines' army is well trained. It's well armed, it's well equipped, and it's picked the ground for battle. And Saul doesn't have the 330,000 he had that first time. In fact, it takes time for people to gather. And when the Philistines came and took the center ground there, they kind of took over the paths that people had to get to Saul. And so what they did, all of Israel went to ground. Later we'll see even some of them joined the Philistines. So Saul is hugely outnumbered. He's been outmaneuvered. Now it's his move. Samuel had sent word to Saul, I will be there in Gilgal in 7 days. I'll come and I'll bless our army, and we'll see what God does. Well, verse 8 says, Saul waited 7 days, and Samuel didn't come. And what people Saul did have following him kind of disappearing, scattering in 2s and 3s. His army was melting away. So Saul made a decision. A big decision. A life-changing decision. And we read about it in verse 9. And so Saul said, "Bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. And as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Saul went out to greet him. But Samuel said to him, "What have you done?" What had Saul done? Well, he had usurped the authority of the priesthood, for starters, the position and authority of Samuel. And why does it matter? Well, ever since the Exodus, God, generation after generation, had been trying to hammer home into the people of Israel one central lesson: I am holy. At Sinai, anything, anyone, any of your animals touches my holy mountain, it must die. In Canaan, any of you, if you take treasure, if you take spoil from the conquest, you must die. In the history of the judges, judgment would come upon Israel because they would defame God's holiness by worshiping idols and false gods. Eli and his sons had been rejected because they had sinned against the holiness of God. Samuel's sons, likewise, were rejected from service. Because to serve as a priest to the Most High God requires the highest levels of personal purity. In the book of James, chapter 3, he warns us of very similar issues. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, "Let not many of you become teachers, because those who are, we know that as such we will incur a stricter judgment." 1 Timothy outlines the requirements for deacons, for elders, and for pastors. And it's very demanding. Because God is holy. And while none of us are perfect, those that would stand for God before His people have more expected of them. Not perfectly holy, but we are expected to remain above reproach. Saul was by no means above reproach. He was not even particularly religious, as we can see by his answer to Samuel's question. Saul answered Samuel, "Because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Saul gives 5 excuses to Samuel. The first is very telling. He says, "The people were fleeing. They were scattering from me." With 330,000 men, Saul had won a great victory. But with 3,000 men, he saw no way to accomplish it. And on top of that, those he had were running away. Saul had waited 7 days for God and God's man to come, and God was late. Saul couldn't afford to wait any longer. Second excuse, "You didn't come in time. It's your fault." All of Israel is having trouble getting to Gilgal. Samuel was a little delayed. Probably about a day, because it says he came as soon as Saul had finished the offering. "But you should have been here. And why should I have to wait for you anyway? You're retired." Remember that whole speech last chapter? I can do anything you can anyway. I'm the king. I waited 7 days out of respect for you. But I had work to do. I had work to do. His third excuse. The Philistines were gathering. There's danger. This is a crisis. And it demands action now. His fourth excuse comes straight out of that, though. They will march here against me. The real issue here, I am in danger. We've already seen Saul is a coward. And he was afraid. And his fifth excuse, I had not asked the favor of the Lord. That's interesting. Since there's no indication he asked the favor of the Lord, and he started this war in the first place. 5 excuses why Saul deemed it acceptable to go ahead and offer the sacrifice. Couldn't afford to wait. He had work to do. It was a crisis demanding action. He was in danger. And he hadn't asked the Lord's favor. You ever felt like that? Ever felt like there's bad stuff going on and you're getting a little desperate? The resources are running out. Your time is running out. You just can't afford to wait any longer. Something has to be done now. When the washing machine is flooding your basement, then you have to do something right now. When your house is on fire, something has to be done right then. However, in fear, we far too often see necessity in the unnecessary. We think we're at that point of no return when really we're just at the end of our comfort. We've reached the end of our faith. There's no crisis known to man that cannot be made worse by doing the wrong thing. Had the people of Israel, poof, ceased to exist? No. In that case, those who had fled could certainly return. Even if they didn't. At this point in Israel's history, God had used Gideon and only 300 men to overcome even greater numbers. Were the Philistines already surrounding Saul, charging down on him into battle? No. So there was yet time to wait on the Lord. But Saul felt threatened. Saul was a coward. And so he operated out of fear instead of faith. He was more interested in politics than in patience. But the truth is, God often waits past what we see as the last minute. Just so to test us, individually, corporately, even as a nation. Because God likes to remind us that nothing is impossible with Him. So He gives us situations where we have to decide, will we trust Him to do what He has said He will do? Will we trust Him and do what He has told us? Or as Saul, do we take matters into our own hands? Well, Saul's decision had made some very enormous ramifications for his life. In verse 13, Samuel answered Saul. He didn't answer any of his excuses. There's no answer to an excuse. An excuse is pointless. Samuel answered Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which He commanded you. But now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for Himself a man after His own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over His people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded you. Saul was going to lose it all. Saul had demonstrated that when things were looking bad, Saul was going to take care of Saul. He didn't turn to the Lord. Instead, he attempted to use the trappings of religion like some sort of good luck charm to rally the troops, to remind Israel of their obligations. And hey, you never know, God just might do something. But hey, we'd never be guilty of such things ourselves, would we? I mean, we'd never say, God, you have until Monday to give me the answer to this, and then I've got to do one or the other. And if you don't say anything, I'm going to assume by your silence, this is what you want me to do. We'd never as a church say, Lord, here are our plans, bless them, because we've already got them scheduled and we're going to do them anyway. When things start looking bad, we never try to cover our bases and say, we best go to church this week and make God happy. We never make decisions based on such faulty reasoning. And we never lie to ourselves either. The truth is, we've all been there. We've been right at the edge, feeling ourselves pushed by fear. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear that God is not really who and what He says He is, and that He won't do what He promises to do. And so we make bad decisions, motivated out of fear, out of pride, out of guilt. That's bad enough. But when you couple a bad decision with responsibility and influence, that's when our decisions can ruin our lives and the lives of others. Everyone makes bad decisions. But when we have a responsibility to others, it magnifies the consequences of our decisions. When our decisions influence others negatively, these are the things that God takes very seriously. And maybe you say, hey, lucky me. I don't have a lot of responsibility towards others. You know, I don't have much influence. Do you have any siblings? Brothers or sisters? Do they know the Lord? Do you want them to? Do you want them to have a closer walk with the Lord? Maybe you don't have siblings. Do you have parents? And I know as children we don't think much about our parents needing us, but there are times when our parents need our strength. They need our faith and our encouragement. Do you have children? Jesus said it would be better for you to hang a millstone around your neck and be tossed into the ocean than to cause a child to stumble. You have children. You have responsibility. What about influence? I tell you, unless you live in a bubble on some distant island that Google hasn't even found yet, you are watched. You are listened to. And we will be held accountable for the influence that we make on other people's lives. But surely we will never be in a position like Saul. I mean, he was king. Alright, that's true. It's unlikely we will ever have that much responsibility for so many people. But I can promise you this. There will come a time, or more than one time, in your life where you will have to choose. Do you stand in faith? Do you wait on the Lord? Do you step out where reason fails you? Publicly, declaring for all to see your reliance on Christ, or not? Will you instead respond out of fear, out of pride, out of doubt? God gives to all of us opportunities to make great decisions in full view of everyone. Because when we do it right, He is glorified. We grow, and others are drawn to Him. And when it happens, when that time in your life comes, most of the time He lets you know. If you belong to Him, His voice speaks, you feel it in the depths of your heart. This decision matters. He doesn't leave you in doubt. And one way or the other, your life is going to change forever. What are you going to do? How are you going to respond? Let's pray.